When you think of the 1980s, what comes to mind? MTV, Knight Rider, Ronald Reagan, Super Nintendo, Back to the Future, hair metal. Whatever it is, it's probably not books. But I think the 1980s is an underrated decade for literature. In fact, one might say it's the most bodacious. Confederacy of Dunces was actually written in the 1960s, and I would definitely consider it a cult classic. In fact, anytime I make a post about Catch-22 or other really well-known satirical novels, people always name drop this one. Despite him writing it in the 1960s, John Kennedy Toole could not get this book published, which probably had a lot to do with his subsequent depression and suicide, and it was published posthumously in 1980. It's about a guy in his 30s that's kind of really smart, but underachieving, still lives in his mom's basement. He thinks he has the solution to all of the world's problems and just sits around critiquing society and everyone around him. In that way, A Confederacy of Dunces seems like it's almost clairvoyant, because that reminds me of a lot of people these days. Everyone seems to think that they're an expert on everything, and most people are presenting themselves on the internet with this fake persona that's heavily curated or just completely fabricated. Either way, this book is now considered a classic, and it is said to have influenced David Foster Wallace and Jonathan Franzen. But because this book was written 20 years before the decade in question, let's move on to something that's truly an 80s book. Don DeLillo is kind of a quintessential lit bro author. If someone's a fan of Pynchon, Wallace, Cormac McCarthy, they're probably also a fan of Don DeLillo. He is considered one of America's greatest living authors, and White Noise is a great example of why. It's an absolute masterclass on social critique and satire. White Noise was published in 1985, and for me reading it, it felt very much like it embodied the 80s. I couldn't help but keep imagining The Simpsons while I was reading it. White Noise follows the story of a blended family. The husband's name is Jack Gladney, and despite being a university professor, he's kind of a bumbling idiot. His wife's name is Babette, and she's kind of a cliche pill-addicted housewife. The 80s was a time where the stereotype really started to pop up because the traditional gender roles and their flaws of following them were really starting to rear their ugly heads, and you mix in the hyper-consumerism of the 1980s, and you had some problems. And that's what White Noise is all about. Hyper-consumerism. And like A Confederacy of Dunces, the book is kind of ahead of its time. There are many moments within the story that seem like they could have been plucked right out of a news headline from 2020. Now let's move on to a book that is a very far departure from the two I've already mentioned. Despite what some people might tell you, Beloved is Toni Morrison's most famous work, and like A Confederacy of Dunces, it's also a Pulitzer Prize winner. Now, I don't have a physical copy here with me, but I can tell you that even though Toni Morrison was a very well respected and established author by the time Beloved came out in 1987, in fact, she'd already published 4 novels up to that point, this is the book that really cemented her legacy as one of America's greatest writers. Beloved takes place about 10 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and follows the story of a former slave and her 18-year-old daughter. And this book is also one of the greatest examples of American magical realism, which is obviously a genre that really got its start in the Latin boom. Now, I've previously only read Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison, and I thought it was a great book. Next on my list from her is probably The Bluest Eye, but given how much hype is around Beloved and how influential it's been, I will definitely get around to reading it at some point. And Toni Morrison has inspired so many authors that have come after her, particularly from the Black community, Colson Whitehead, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Beloved is definitely a book that stood the test of time. We're almost 40 years out from its publication, and people are still reading it and still talking about it. But let's shift gears here a little bit and move to the only nonfiction book on my list, and it's a book that decades later inspired rap lyrics. Not only is A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn the only nonfiction book on this list, it's probably also the most controversial, and once again, I don't know where my physical copy of this book went. A People's History is one of the first history books to really challenge the mainstream narrative of history, particularly the type that we learn here in the US, which is kind of told you like, hey, Christopher Columbus discovered America, and then they had Thanksgiving and everyone got along. Zinn's goal for this book was to tell the story of everyday people rather than a macro view of politicians and militaries and their strategies that they're trying to employ. It's an extremely polarizing book with more progressive-minded people championing it and more conservative-leaning people saying that it's a work of revisionist history. But no matter where you come down on that issue, there's no denying that the book has been extremely influential in the way that we look at history and on pop culture. As previously mentioned, the book has inspired the lyrics to Vinnie Paz's song You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train, which also happens to be the name of Zinn's memoir, and it's also been name-dropped in pop culture elsewhere, including Good Will Hunting.
You want to read a real history book, read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. That book will knock you on your ass.
Now let's time travel from the history of the US to a dystopian future. Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale takes place in a fictional theocracy in a dystopian future called Gilead, where there's a severe fertility issue, and the women who are still able to conceive are forced to do so by an authoritarian government. Published in 1985, The Handmaid's Tale was nominated for the Booker Prize, and it has since been turned into a series starring... who's it starring? Starring Elizabeth Moss. The Handmaid's Tale is often included in must-read dystopian fiction, along with Orwell's 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World. This is one of the books on today's list that I haven't read yet, but again, you really can't deny how popular this book remains 40 years after it was published. And there's no question that Margaret Atwood is one of Canada's most critically acclaimed authors. Next, we're going to hop back into our time machine, hit 88 miles per hour, and travel from a dystopian future back to a dangerous past to take a look at what some people call the Great American Novel. Lonesome Dove is extremely intimidating because of its length, but it is one of the easiest books to read, not just because the language is very straightforward, but it's also a page-turner. While I do think that this book is sometimes a little overhyped, it is very good. It has some of the most memorable characters, and it's an incredibly exciting and entertaining read. It's about two retired U.S. Marshals named Carl and Gus living in Texas in the mid to late 19th century. They spent their entire careers hunting down lawless men and warding off dangerous Indians, and now they're going to try to make it big, driving cattle to the mostly undeveloped Montana wilderness. And like a few of the other books I've already put on today's list, this is again a Pulitzer Prize winner. That was not intentional. Lonesome Dove is funny, it's sad, it's engaging, and most importantly, it's still wildly popular 40 years on. We're going to hop back into our time machine one more time and head back to the future to discuss a book that literally invented a genre. I had reservations about putting Neuromancer by William Gibson in this video because, full disclosure, I didn't really love it, but it's too important of a book and too influential to not include it when you're talking about books of the 80s. On its face, it's a sci-fi, but it spawned the cyberpunk genre, which is a genre that kind of combines the high technology of science fiction and the low class or criminal underbelly of these dystopian futures. Neuromancer specifically tells the story of Case, who is a cyber hacker that's been blacklisted from the industry after he completely botched a job for one of his clients. This book has inspired comics and movies and music. Obviously, a big one is the Matrix trilogy. There's also another Keanu Reeves movie called Johnny Mnemonic, which is based on another story by William Gibson. Neuromancer is actually the first book to win the science fiction Triple Crown, the Hugo Award, the Nebula Award, and the Philip K. Dick Award. Obviously, it's highly critically acclaimed, but it did have some criticism when it came out, which was that Gibson was too fast with the world building and it made it kind of hard to keep track of what was going on. And honestly, that's a pretty good summary of how I felt about it. With that said, if you have any interest in science fiction or cyberpunk books, this is still worth a read just because of how influential it was. So there you go. The 80s was an awesome time for books. And honestly, there are so many books I could have put on this list. I just couldn't fit them all in. I mean, Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose. Rushdie came out with Midnight's Children. I mean, hell, even Vonnegut published 3 books in the 80s alone. So I want to know, which books would you have put on this list, and which decade do you think was the best for literature? Also, if you like this video, you can support the channel by sharing it with your friends, or if you want to step it up a notch, join our book club. The link is down below. And if you want to hear my in-depth thoughts about Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, you can watch our podcast episode about it here.